Why, hello everybody. My name is Steve Usher and a warm welcome to the Experienced Designers podcast. Okay, so before we jump into this episode, I thought I'd just give a little bit of context as to kind of how it came about. One of the themes I'm really keen to explore this year in 2021 is around the future of human resources as a function. So if you think about HR for a minute in your own organisation or organisations you've worked in previously, would it be fair to say that in some of those environments, maybe they've got a bad rap or not the greatest perception or bad PR? And maybe that might be just in how they go about working or how the organisation is set up. But last year it changed, I think. There was a really big momentum. HR really stepped up during COVID. It had to, of course, to support their people in a monumental challenge. But that forced out a lot of really interesting changes. And so what does this situation mean? Is it a catalyst for something that could really accelerate some of these questions around the future of the HR profession and also as a function? And so when I saw that Lars Schmidt from Amplify Talent, based in the US, had released a book called Redefining HR, I was absolutely thrilled when he agreed to come and join me on the show. Yes, to talk about the book, but also to just share his own experience as a HR professional. And also we delve into these areas around HR as a profession and also as a function. So without further ado, thank you as always for listening. I really do appreciate it and enjoy the show. So Lars, welcome to the Experienced Designers.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's good to be here.
Yeah, welcome. I've been looking forward to this one. I know you've been super active in the HR space, and as we know, there's a lot going on right now when we talk about those two words. So super excited to have you on the show. So Lars, I did a quick Google actually of your name. I wanted to share this with you. I don't know if you actually Googled your name and seen what comes up, because it was quite an interesting discovery I found.
I do, but of course, as you know, with Google, my results will be different than your results. So yeah.
And this is why this came up. Okay, good shit. I didn't make that connection. Okay, so there was another chap called Lars Schmidt, who was a Swedish theatrical producer and director and publisher. Okay. And he owned theaters in Paris and France and Sweden. And he was massively instrumental in bringing American theater to the European stage. And I looked him up and did a bit more digging. He was in the 1950s, 40s. Mm-hmm. And he was a really big, for me, there was a little bit of a connection in there. So that instrumental in bringing American theatre to the European stage. I just thought, well, the latest Lars Schmidt is really big on bringing change and the HR, future of HR to the bigger stage as well. So you have a kindred spirit in history, which seems like you're replicating.
Hey, maybe we, us Lars Schmidts have a common tie. Interestingly enough, a while ago, I used to run recruiting for Ticketmaster in LA. And there was another Lars Schmidt in LA who was a recruiter who recruited at Red Bull. And the funny thing is, we never met, but often we would have, oh, you're Lars Schmidt. Like, no, I'm a different Lars Schmidt. So we joked, we were Twitter friends. We said one day we're going to start a company called Lars and Lars. But that was interestingly enough.
Good stuff. Well, just for those that don't know you, Lars, just an introduction into yourself.
So I'm Lars Schmidt. I am the founder of a company called Amplify. We do HR executive search and consulting. Also do some media work. So I write for Fast Company, host a podcast called Redefining HR. I just published my second book, also called Redefining HR, based in Northern Virginia outside of DC. I'm a dad, I'm a husband. I've been here on the East Coast for about 20, or been in the field of HR for about 20 years. Prior to starting my own firm, I ran global recruiting teams and talent teams at Ticketmaster and Magento and NPR.
Awesome. And I wanted to, because I did a bit of digging. And when I say digging, I mean, I looked at your LinkedIn profile, so I didn't go too far. But it was, you mentioned kind of Ticketmaster there. So there was, when I used to be a recruiter as well. So when you look at people's CVs or LinkedIn profiles, I imagine them as a bit of a journey, to how we progress and how we develop as people. And when I looked at kind of this chunk in your career, it was really interesting. It was like 7.5 years at Ticketmaster, and then obviously latterly Live Nation. And then also a little bit later, 3 years at NPR. So I was kind of going, well, there's a connection in here, something about music, entertainment, content. But also just a question there around that piece in your career. If you're on reflection, if you look back on it, what grounding did it give you for where you are today? What's some of the kind of the red threads or themes or passions or the drive that's been kind of born in that period in your career?
Yeah, I mean, they were both fundamental, but in different ways. So I think at Ticketmaster, I had for the majority of about half my time there. So I was there for 7 years. I think I had 8 different jobs, over that time. So it was a wild ride. But for half of my time there, I reported to our chief people officer, Beverly Carmichael, who we'd hired from Southwest Airlines. And she was my boss, but also a mentor and became a friend. But really, very progressive on how she viewed the HR and kind of people and talent function, and the role of HR in supporting employee experience, and leading with compassion, and just all these things. I think working for her, it really kind of calibrated for me like what modern HR is and what HR can be at our best, and like what our default should be in terms of our priorities and how we try to serve the employees and the organization. NPR was different in the sense that it was my first time working in a nonprofit. I had no budget, I had very, very little team, I had very little resources, but I had a boss there who was really empowering, for me. And so I was like, okay, they brought me in to lead their transformation from radio and broadcast to digital. So, now we're a nonprofit competing against for-profit in 2 verticals, right? Technology, which was everybody, and media and journalism, which, there's lots of for-profit organizations that we're competing against. And so that was around 2011. And we went all in on employer brand because I was like, I'm never going to have the budget to match these companies we're competing against. So we've got to compete in a different way. And so it was very much, my boss was like, okay, you can try whatever you want if you think it's going to work. And so we were able to be real pioneers in employer brand there. And then that, kind of got me, that was like a next shift in my own career, understanding the power of employer brand and a new way to recruit and digital engagement, and, which led to more curiosity on design and video and obviously, audio and podcasts. So they both really set the foundation for what I'm doing now, but in very different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think what popped there was, having a boss from Southwest Airlines. Obviously, the culture there is, inventive, it's creative, but then also with NPR, it's about doing more with less, and I think that requires a different mindset and a different level of creativity as well. So I can definitely understand that. One other thing I noticed as well is that you follow, like myself, Brené Brown.
Mm-hmm.
What inspirations do you take from Brené and her work?
I mean, just the idea of being able to, lead with empathy and compassion. And, empathy is a word we use a lot in HR right now. I think it's probably in some cases misused and overused, but, the idea of being very accepting of yourself to accept others. I think that certainly resonates. I think that's a struggle that everybody juggles to one extent or another. But yeah, I like her work. I like her voice. I like her realness. I can appreciate, her message and how she conveys it. So yeah.
Yeah. I think she's one of those people that every word that she speaks, it just lands, she just speaks so much sense. Yeah. But I also love the fact that she's massively an introvert. So I'm more of an extrovert. I'm a kind of eye on disc. So I love kind of being on stage or talking and sharing passion. So, but I can imagine being like an introvert and they're having to get on stage. For her, every time must be as she says, stepping into the arena, right? So hugely respectful. But let's talk a little bit about kind of 2020, because I think the link in there is like empathy and 2020. So just from like a HR point of view, what the hell happened in 2020, Lars? What's some of the reflections and what happened?
I mean, what didn't happen?
What didn't happen?
Right? I mean, 2020 was as seismic as it gets in terms of how much events, change, friction, stress, transformation, we can fit into 1 year. I mean, I think that we were, obviously an event like that, and when I say an event like that, it was multiple events, right? It was the pandemic and everything related to that. It was George Floyd's murder and the increased conversation around racism and social justice and inequity. For those of us in the U.S., it was incredibly polarizing, toxic political cycle and an election period and an attempted insurrection to start this year. I mean, it was a lot, and HR was on the front lines of all of it. And so I think it was a uniquely difficult. I mean, it's difficult for everybody. So I don't mean to undershare the challenge that all those events presented on everybody, but I think it was uniquely difficult for the HR function because we were on the front lines of all of that, and we were navigating all of those things, both from the perspective of navigating our organizations and businesses through that, and in some cases trying to keep them afloat. Right, that were very threatened by just the way that lockdowns and everything impacted the business. Keeping their teams, their direct teams, the entire people population and the employees of the organization, and then themselves. And so it was, it was a lot, and it continues to be a lot. Like I think we've moved through that. We're moving through some of those events, but we're not done doing that yet. So I think the optimist in me looks at those events and gets excited about what's ahead of us and the future that we can now kind of redefine, as a result, in some cases, of those events. But we have to also just kind of, take a moment and honor and appreciate what we've been through and what we're continuing to go through.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think I've always felt like HR has had this kind of internal perception or PR challenge, when you kind of say those two words in many organizational contexts, people tend to go, oh, HR, or, so there's a bit of an identity crisis. But I have to say, last year, I heard so many great things about HR, how they, and I don't want to say stepped up, because they step up. Don't get me wrong. It's not because it's a lack of step up, but there was a really good flow and appreciation for how the HR supported the organization, particularly in these scenarios where, there was huge change, rapid adjustments, mindsets that have been so deep-rootedly stuck in this kind of traditional way of work that now has to, because it was a need to change it completely. So I think there's just been an amazing opportunity, I think, for HR to really, to experiment. I think the experimentation, is a really important bit as well, to showcase that, we can experiment with this stuff and things kind of always still work out. We can make it work along the way. Yeah.
Well, I think the reality too is like, you can have the most inventive HR team, but if you don't have an executive team that buys into what they're trying to do, they're not going to be able to do it, right? They're not going to be able to get that done. And so I think in some cases, what going through the pandemic did is it unlocked the HR teams and the people teams to be able to drive innovation and probably do things that they've been pushing for months or years, but maybe they met resistance at the executive level. Now that resistance was kind of cleared a little bit based on the circumstances, and it gave them more runway to try and do things differently. And so, I think it's, so you're right. I think that, legacy HR, there is often that stigma associated with the function, but there's a very big part of the field that does not self-identify in that at all. Like the impact they're bringing to the business is transformative and substantial, and it's seen that way. And so I think that, the events kind of cleared the way for more practitioners to start moving in that direction. And again, I think, as I mentioned, kind of the optimism for the future, I think that's a trend that we'll continue to see as we take this moment to kind of, again, redefine, re-engineer how we work and how we, create environments that allow all employees to thrive.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's an interesting intersection right now around, especially this kind of hybrid working, or however we want, what words we want to use to describe this future of work, or whatever. But it's kind of, this transition that we've kind of gone into. But then, how does it work moving back? So, I think for me, I think the word design or redesign is a really important, or actually add another word into that, intentional design.
Yeah.
Is a really important thing here around. Just ensuring that people's voices are heard, particularly with part or some of the workforce. We're now working from home. A lot of that workforce are seeking opportunities to maybe have part time, in at home and some time in the office. How are you? What are you seeing from that point of view as well around that particular topic, and how HR are getting involved in that piece? I noticed you did something on open source, like an open source doc to help people with this kind of particular topic, which is so big right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've reached a stage where a lot of us are talking about return to workplace and what that looks like. Not now, but like planning for when that is safe to do so. And it's, as vaccine levels continue to climb, there's optimism that it will be safer to do so. I mean, a date that I'm hearing a lot of is September. July for those who are ambitious, but I think that also is a challenge, especially for parents, because now your kids who, depending on where you are in the world, may have been home with you through much of the lockdown. Now it's their summer and they're home with you the whole time. So the idea of that going back into an office, if you don't have the support networks to support that, it certainly is difficult. I think for those of us who had employees who were able to go and work from their home during this period, and we have to acknowledge that's not all companies and all employees, but for those that did, I think all of them are hybrid by default now to some extent. And, I think that the opportunity and the challenge for HR now is that, we're going to have to do a much better job of personalizing how we approach supporting employees. Meaning there are some employees who are desperate to get back into an office. The moment it's safe, they're going to be there 5 days a week if they're able to. And that's what's right for them. You have other employees who will never step foot back in your office again. And you have a lot of employees who kind of would like to do something in between. And so, creating and optimizing for hybrid is going to be the next big shift, because especially for companies that didn't have remote and they were used to, being in an office and had a co-location, culture and orientation, when they shifted to remote, most of them just ported all of their policies and rituals and communications that you used to do in an office to a remote setting. And many of them haven't really re-engineered that at all yet. I think if they're going to be committing to a hybrid structure, now you have to do that. You have to kind of reorient how you're structured. And as a best practice for hybrid, because hybrid is also the most difficult construct between kind of co-located, entirely distributed, or hybrid. Hybrid is the hardest. So you also have to, ideally design your programs as if everybody is remote, so that you're not creating kind of two classes of employees and giving inherent advantages to people who can come into an office versus those who don't.
Yeah, I saw it. I didn't read it. I read the first bit, and then when you see a post and you read it and then quickly move on to something else, our attention these days. But there was a piece. I think it was the CEO or CEO of Google. I think it was a few weeks ago. There was a piece around their concern around the erosion of their culture. Was one of their main concerns, particularly like how we redefine that future of work, and or certainly how we work from a hybrid point of view.
I think that's a real concern. You have to work a lot harder to preserve that in an environment where you don't have people coming into an office and having those kind of serendipitous coffee chats and, water cooler moments and those kind of things. It was interesting. I was talking to Patagonia's CHRO, Dean Carter, on my podcast a couple of weeks ago.
Cool.
And he had mentioned like they were very co-located. They're based in Santa Barbara. That's like their juice and their energy and their mojo comes from co-location, and they don't want to give that up. Like they're looking at kind of hybrid constructs, but for the most part, they want everybody to be based there. And, he raised a really interesting point that I hadn't thought about, is that as more organizations shift to fully remote or hybrid, it's diminishing culture and kind of creating a bit of a commoditization of work. Meaning, if I'm a software engineer and now I can work for Google, Facebook, Amazon, whoever, from wherever, remotely, what what ties me to that job. Like I can much more easily move from one job to the next job to the next job because they're all kind of the same.
Yes.
They're all pay kind of the same. They have the same, like, because I'm not going to an office, there's no, office culture magic that will, that makes that environment more sticky for me. So I think that those are all, it was a really interesting point that I hadn't considered that I think as we kind of move through this, we definitely need to be thinking about, and be intentional about how we design, to create environments that allow us to retain our talent.
Yeah, I agree. And it's super fragmented because if you think of them as user groups, just, your employees as different user groups and requirements and needs and desires and wants and all these things, you've got to be, I think this is where design thinking, as an example, from a human-centric point of view, is that bottom-up thinking. I think it's really important organizations do that really take the time to do the research. You've got your most captive audience, which is your employees. So do the research, start to really empathize, understand what's going on, and design around that, and then see how that fits in. Also balance that with the needs of the business as well. So I think it's interesting times. There's lots to come.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
So look, let's get into the book, Redefining HR. So when I saw it, I had a chuckle to myself. It's one of those moments you see a book and you just shake your head and go, oh, talk about perfect timing of a book release. So I don't know if you saw the pandemic coming when you were writing it. I'm not sure. Tell just, I'd love to just know a little bit about how long does a book like this take to construct? Like what was the process you had to go through? Just I'm always curious.
Yeah. I mean, so I had, I'll give you the kind of the how the book came to be, because that'll shed some light on that. Yeah, cool. So, I've been covering, what people loosely call the future of work, for years, through my podcast, through conference talks, through my first book on employer branding, through columns in Fast Company and Forbes. So I've been examining it for years and years and years. And I think that, I had all these disparate pieces of content that cover different components of it. And while I was, I think all the content, the individual content was valuable, it didn't tell a cohesive, overarching story. And that's really what I wanted to do in the book, is I wanted to write that cohesive narrative around what great HR looks like today, and what it can be, and basically essentially lay kind of a framework for modern HR. I had, in terms of writing the book, I signed the book deal with Kogan Page in January of 2020. I had an idea of the chapters at that point and kind of what I wanted to say. I had, excerpts from podcasts and interviews I had that I knew I'd be bringing into the book in terms of, practitioner essays and stories and quotes. So I had some of that content already, pulled aside. And then the COVID, the pandemic hit. And the very beginning of the COVID, as it was coming, I began, curating a massive open source resource to help companies kind of navigate things like shifting to remote work and, keeping an eye out for increased, racism against, their Asian employee base at that time. That was a real concern. And obviously it still is now, if you look at what's happening here in the US, at least. And looking at just all the different, nuances and components around that. I knew that we were going through something that we've never experienced before as a field. And I felt that in that scenario, in that situation, I could provide unique value in leveraging my global network and getting them to kind of release some of their pandemic response guidelines and programs, so that everybody else who's sitting there like, what the hell do I do? And their CEOs and the executive team are looking at them like, what are we going to do? I wanted to help them have answers. And so, the first, so basically from, the second half of February to really through March, I kind of dropped everything just to work on that open source platform. And then in April, started writing a little bit. My publisher was furloughed for a little bit out of London. And then they came back and I realized that my deadline was fast approaching. And I was like, I'm going to need an extension at this point. So I think, I'd had some of the content together. I think in terms of like sitting down and writing, it was probably about 4 months. But the benefit of, I think, the delay in when I really started writing was I was able to write the book after George Floyd's murder, while we were kind of, months into the pandemic and sheltering from home and dealing with things like burnout and stress and mental health and all the things that were very real. So I was able to write a book about HR now, right? With stories and examples and quotes and referencing events that were unfolding in real time in 2020. And so the fortunate aspect of that is, then the book comes out in January, and it's really the first, not only is it a framework for modern HR, but it's the first book that was really, written in the time of the pandemic and everything that happened in 2020.
Amazing.
So yeah.
Amazing. Lucky. That's lucky, man. That's good. So can I just ask, as part of that kind of research and interview phase when you went through, certainly last year when you were talking to people right on the kind of the coal face of what was going on from a COVID perspective, just what did you start to see when you kind of started to bring all your research and those interviews together? Was there anything, or what were the themes that was started to become immediately like apparent to you as some of the themes or consistencies?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I went through all of the interviews and kind of distilled all of the notes and kind of extracted the key points, it clarified a vision that I was already starting to see around contrasts between modern HR and legacy HR. And so, I kind of opened with that. I think in chapter 1 of the book, I lay out those contrasts, things like moving from, command and control structures to decentralize and power, moving from, a compliance orientation to how we look at policy and designing policy against the few towards policy for the many, right? There is, probably 10 or 12 different key contrasts and shifts between how these modern operators work and think than how their legacy counterparts do. And so, that in essence kind of became the foundation of the book. And then in the chapters throughout, I examined, many of those areas in more depth. And that's where I brought in some of the different, quotes and case studies and spotlights.
Amazing. Have you got any kind of specific stories or anything that kind of showcases best practice or, a HR function that's been redefined?
A ton of them throughout the book. I think,
is there any that stand out?
I think, because I'm obviously, as I've been doing PR stuff for the book, I get asked that question a lot. I mean, there's two companies and two HR leaders that I find myself continually learning from and being impressed by their work. And I think now, these are two that I think if somebody's like, who should I emulate? I'll give you two. One is Spotify. And their CHRO, Katarina Berg. I think she's phenomenal. And they're doing some really innovative work. And the second is HubSpot. With Katie Burke as their chief people officer. What I like about both of them, there's a lot of things I like about both of them, but what stands out to me is that it's not just their embrace of innovative practices and approaches, but their embrace of open source, which to me is one of the biggest drivers of change and moving us towards better places in the space. Like they work out loud, they share what they do when they launch a program. Typically, it's accompanied by an HR perspective, like, hey, we're 5 weeks into this. Here's what we're learning. Here's why we made these decisions. Here's what we screwed up. Here's what, if you're going to do this thing, look out for this element of it because it's a landmine for you. So I think that that humility, that inventiveness, that creativeness, and the willing to kind of put yourself out there, with it. So you're not just doing good for your company, you're doing good for the industry. Those are two leaders in two companies that, anything they do has my attention.
Yeah. I thought the release a couple of weeks ago, was it from Spotify around their policy around flexible working? They were kind of one of the first to really craft that. And I thought the communication of it was brilliant. A lot of the stuff, you can just tell it's so carefully considered. They've done their work beforehand before releasing that. So I'm a big fan. Obviously, being in Sweden, I get the opportunity to hear Katrina's name many, many times, and I have seen her speak as well. And what I really, really love about her is she takes no BS in that. She really calls it out, and she was really encouraging the HR people in the group or in the room that I was a part of, to really call it out, to step up and to be brave, and to, it was just brilliant. And I think she's a real credit to the industry for sure.
Yeah, totally agree.
Just out of interest, I mean, this is you mentioned command and control, and I think this is a really interesting one just to look back on, because we've got this kind of systemic. And I see this quite a lot here in Sweden, because Sweden's, they did really well in the industrial era. They did extremely well, from a economic progressive point of view. But I think, the success of HR and redefining HR, I think kind of hangs on the organizational piece as well, for them to also shift their way in which they work. Because if we suddenly kind of redefine a HR function as a function, turn it into this kind of agile, Usain Bolt beast inside an organization that likes to do, marathons, there's going to be some challenges. What do you see with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm very deliberate about in the book is that I don't believe in best practices. I don't cite best practices. Obviously, I mentioned two companies now that I admire their work. Don't try to replicate what they do, because you can't. Like, the way that the reason that succeeds there is because they have all the unique circumstances around it that allow that to be successful. Be inspired by it, do a version of that, but do a version of that that's localized to your own organization. And the reality is, not every company is ready for, if you use the analogy of like that, Usain Bolt, Ferrari level HR, that you can't just plug that into any company, right? It has to be aligned with the culture, the business, the stage of business, the executive and leadership team, the resources that you need to drive it, the health of the culture of the organization to embrace it. So there's so many different variables to it, which is why I think you can't just, it's not plug and play. And so if you're not there now and you want to be there, that's a journey. Like, that's a process to get there. And you have to start in areas where you think you can pilot and scale and probably have, some quicker gains and traction. But you can't just port those practices to any other company and see the same results.
Yeah, agree. Okay. So Lars, imagine we're sitting here, like, say we've got like an organizational structure. So, when you have an overarching business organizational structure and you see the hierarchy and you see all the functional, finance, L&D, HR. If we were to take a rubber and just kind of take off HR for a minute, what do you expect, or what are you seeing as part of the book and the research that you and some of the best practices that you've seen and where some organizations currently are? If we were to then start to write in the future people function, what would we be writing instead of those words, kind of HR as a overriding function? How do you see that evolving? What kind of things do you think would be adding in?
There's you see lots of things out there today. You see HR, you see people operations, you see talent culture, you see people in places, you see employee experience, you see people experience, right? I mean, and to me, I don't necessarily, I don't think you can say it's absolutely this, or it's absolutely that. And that's, and I kind of make that point in the beginning of redefining HR. I think a lot of people, when they hear that title, they think, oh, it's like changing the name from HR to something else. I'm like, no, it's about the impact and the capabilities. I don't really care what you call yourself, except for human capital. I strongly dislike human capital. No. Please don't use human capital. But other than that, I don't think it really matters. I think you have to figure out what's gonna best reflect the work that you're doing. And so, I think, I like people experience. I like people, I like people experience. I think those are probably the two that I personally lean towards, but that's just personal preference. I'm not saying that is what, what people should be locking into.
Yeah, agree. I mean, I think one of, it's not specifically HR related, but I know there's the amazing case for ABN AMRO in the Netherlands, where they were super lucky because they were actually redefining their CX strategy at the time. And what they managed to do was also pitch in and do the kind of EX strategy. So they ended up kind of embedding the strategy into the HR services and operating model very, very early. So they were super lucky. And then they kind of added in an element around providing HR and some of the teams with agile and design thinking, sprint knowledge. And then they implemented like a really solid data, people analytics and listening strategy. So that just, those kind of fundamentals, I think really have served them extremely well. And are now running, multiple kind of EX products, to bring, to add value into the business. And they're listening constantly. They're taking those kind of insights and then turning them into kind of product teams and then going into kind of an agile implementation. So that kind of stuff is, for me, like right on probably that top 10% of organizations they're doing amazing work.
Yeah.
What else have you seen on that? Have you seen any kind of really innovative structures or ways of working?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you touched on a lot of things that I think are kind of hallmarks to some of the innovative organizations out there. That employee-centric design thinking, agile practices that aren't heavily engineered, like they have the ability to adapt and adjust with the business and the priorities shift. I think that they work, working in sprints. Too often, if you look at legacy HR, the way, the effort it took for us to get shit done was Herculean, right? We had to make a business case. We had to validate the business case. We had to get all the stakeholders to sign off on the business case. We had to pilot. We had to adjust. We had to scale. We had to get sign off on. So it would take us months and months and months or years to roll out a new program. And that's just not realistic for the times we're in right now. So I think, operating in 3-month sprints, right? So whether you do kind of formal OKRs or just a looser approach, it allows you to be more nimble and make sure that you're building to the needs of the business, because the needs of the business are dynamic, and modern HR operators are business operators that are focused on people. So they get that. So if you have a 2-year roadmap in HR, you might be 6 months into that and have a global pandemic hit and blow everything up that you're doing. So, work in smaller chunks, try to be a little bit more agile, at least in mindset and approach. And I think that's a commonality that you find across most of these leading companies.
Yeah, agree. So I just want to also delve, we talked a little bit about the function aspect. I just want to also go a little bit into the HR professionals, those that are on the front line and in the profession. There's this whole, there's the saying around the VUCA reality. And if I was a traditionalist HR individual, you might be looking at this thinking, Christ, what on earth, where's my career going to go? Or how do I develop myself? Or this is coming and I'm not quite ready for it. What do you see from a professional grassroots level and also I think as well from a professional development point of view as well, Lars, that what we're teaching HR pros right now, is it really fit for purpose for the future as well? Is that really aligned? What's your take on that?
Yeah. So 2 questions, I'll tackle them separately. I think the first one, in my view, and I say this in the book, there's never been a better time to be in HR. Whatever it is you want to do, for the most part, there's an opportunity to do it. So, if you want to just be more of a traditional operator, you can do that. There's still plenty of organizations out there with traditional HR functions where you can just be a specialist and just kind of grind on that work. And some people want to do that. Great, you can do that. If you're a creative, there's plenty of creative space for creativity and roles that require it in the role today. If you're a data and quant person, there's most, teams have some level of sophistication around their people analytics function, ranging from like one person to, data scientists who are actually going through, some of the data. So whatever it is you want to do, there's lots of opportunities for that. I think the second part of your question around how are we supporting practitioners in that development? I don't know that we are, to be honest with you. I think a lot of the traditional and longstanding organizations are still, pretty heavily rooted in legacy practices and approaches. They're not really equipped or built to deal agilely with some of these new topics and things that are coming out. And so I think where that is offset is the increase in open source and the fact that there's so many kind of peer communities that you can tap into to share ideas and templates and tools and resources. So that part's exciting. And that's actually, that's the space where I'm now moving more into in terms of my own focus and my own work. So I'm building some accelerator programs to really help practitioners, build those skills that they need to be impactful in today's world.
Yeah, brilliant. And just, I think the whole community side's really interesting, because I think there's, my sense is, please, welcome your thoughts, but my sense is it's becoming less siloed as it used to be. HR used to be quite siloed and not really share as much. It's kind of like the talent acquisition industry versus the recruiter agency industry. I've always found like in-house recruitment community is way more sharing than the agency side. But I've definitely seen like this. It's definitely shift. People are really opening up and sharing a lot more, and it's been really great seeing these communities. And of course, I'm a member of the HR open source community on Facebook, and it's brilliant. You ask any question, and it's just like everyone's just on it straight off, sharing and caring. There's nothing really on there that isn't is left unanswered. So yeah, how are you seeing it? What have you seen that growth? And certainly you founded or co-founded that community.
Yeah, so obviously, with that said, I'm biased in this answer, but I think that peer-to-peer communities are the future of the field. And it's not, it started with HR open source. Then you saw hacking HR and disrupt HR. Disrupt HR was first, but then hacking HR, and kind of Enrique is building a great global network there.
Phenomenal.
Google Rework, they kind of open sourced their platform. They launched that soon after we launched HR open source. And so you're seeing more communities that are kind of filling that void that those legacy organizations aren't serving. And so, to me, like, as you mentioned, you go to these places, you say, here's a issue that I'm struggling with right now. And within an hour, you can get 5 or 6 people who've done that exact thing. And they're sharing specific templates with you and recommendations and, look out for this. And, here's great tech that we use to help us, implement this. And so that's invaluable, right? Especially if you're a practitioner in a small company in, Manchester or Perth or somewhere where you don't have access to a big resource of, people and an ecosystem. And so, maybe a lot of times you might be an HR department of one, but now you have the ability to augment your own skills and capability and experience with that of literally hundreds of thousands of practitioners. And that to me is just transformative. I think that, it continues on with the open source ethos, but it allows practitioners to really lean on each other. And I think that those conversations are much more oriented in in the now, real-time challenges that businesses are facing.
Yeah, amazing. And I think just watching from afar and seeing it first here in Sweden and being a member, as I say, I think you're doing brilliant work, Lars. And I have to say, while I've got you on the show, I just want to say a real credit to you, mate, because I think the open source mindset. And it is a mindset, is an amazing thing. And, be proud of that. You've created some brilliant communities, and it's created and fostered relationships and friendships and, all sorts of great sharing and learning. So, well done on that. And I'm sure you've got some amazing things in the pipeline as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
So Lars, how can people connect with you? Where can they find you? And also, I'll put a link to the book in the show notes. But also, where can they find your book as well?
Yeah, so the book and the podcast and some of those new developmental communities and resources I mentioned that I'm building will all be found on redefininghr.com. Yeah. If you want to learn more about my consulting and search business, it's amplifytalent.com. And then I'm on Twitter at Lars, and of course LinkedIn and all those places. So I would say redefininghr.com and amplifytalent.com are my 2 big hubs.
Amazing. And at Lars for your Twitter handle. Come on, that's amazing. You were in early. Lars, thank you so much. Honestly, it's been a real pleasure, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me on the show. And good luck in everything you're doing.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me on. This is fun.
Good man. Take care. And there you have it, another episode of The Experienced Designers. Thank you so much to my guest, Lars Schmidt. An absolute honour to have you on the show, and wishing you all the very best with the book and, of course, your ongoing endeavours in the HR industry. I wish you well. So, as always, if you want to connect into Lars or take a closer look at the book, all of the links are in the show notes. So, as always, thank you ever so much for listening, and bye for now.